Hi, everyone. Welcome to the UCLA Behavior, Evolution, and Culture speaker series. I'm Clark Barrett. I'm organizing the series this year. We meet every Monday throughout the academic year. And we, I think, have just 4 or 5 weeks left in the quarter, something like that. We're reaching the end of our annual speaker series. We will have a talk next Monday. And let me just mention that one. It's going to be Chris Crupenye, and the title of his talk is The Social Minds of Humans and Other Apes. So please join us for that next Monday at 12 Pacific time. You probably already know this, but you can sign up for our listserv, and you can unsign up for the listserv on the Beck website under the tab Get Involved. It's a listserv that you can send your email address with unsubscribe to that if you want to stop receiving the announcements, and vice versa if you want to start receiving them. This week, it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Shaina Lev Levy, who's joining us from Denmark. Very graciously has agreed to Zoom in and present to us today, even though it is 9 p.m. Denmark time. But Shaina, we're really delighted to have you, and we're really looking forward to your talk. Shaina's talk is called Learning to Forage in Hunter-Gatherer Societies. Go ahead and share your screen, and everyone else, if you'd like to unmute yourself momentarily, join me in welcoming Shaina.
Thank you all so much for having me.
Thanks for coming.
All right.
I'm seeing your desktop. Oh, there we go. You got it. Yep.
Got it? Okay,
Yep.
Good. Okay, awesome. So thank you all so much for having me. Today I'm going to talk to you about how hunter-gatherer children and adolescents learn to hunt and gather. So in this talk, I'm going to cover why we should care. Ooh, you know what? I'm just going to move you all over to this screen so I can see you a bit better. There we go. Sorry.
Sure, no problem.
There we go. All right. So in this talk, I'm going to cover why we should care about childhood and learning as evolutionary researchers. I'm going to tell you what research with contemporary hunter-gatherers can tell us and what they can't tell us about our past. And then I'm going to spend a majority of the talk telling you about my research findings regarding how hunter-gatherer children and adolescents learn. And then at the end, I'll circle back around to tell you how this can help enrich our understanding of human evolution. Whoop. Come back here. There we go. Okay. So let's get started. So why should we care about childhood and learning? So research into childhood and learning can help us understand human life history. So in this talk, I define childhood as the period between birth to maturity at the end of adolescence. And childhood is an evolutionary puzzle. We just have a much longer period of growth and later sexual maturity compared to other members of our clade. Childhood is also characterized by a really long period of dependence. It just takes human children much more time to produce more food than we consume. And so one central question in research on human life history is why? Why does it take us so long to grow? And why does it take us so long to become productive? So there are 3 prominent theories which aim to answer this question. The first is the embodied capital theory proposed by Kaplan and colleagues, and this theory centers the complex foraging niche inhabited by humans during our species evolution. So the resources we collect, meat, but also tubers and nuts, these resources require really specialized knowledge, skill, and tools. And so these skills take a long time to learn. So the embodied capital theory posits that childhood evolved as an extended period for learning these complex tasks. And so in this theory, humans trade off early food production for much later food production of more nutrient-dense and calorie-rich food. And some of the best evidence that comes from the embodied capital theory is studies on hunting in small-scale societies, which show that strength peaks, while strength peaks in early adulthood, hunting returns peak much later when individuals are in their mid to late 40s. And so this suggests that experience more than strength contributes to hunting success. A second view is the pooled energy budget proposed by Kramer and colleagues. So this theory posits that childhood co-evolved with human cooperation. And again, this centers the human foraging niche. And we know that our foraging niche requires specialized technologies, that we inhabit really large ranges, and that we require a lot of food processing. And so this is really too much for any individual child or adult to accomplish on their own. So by growing slowly and spending more time helping their parents and their siblings, children can reap the inclusive benefits of helping other closely related kin. And then when they're much older, they can reap direct benefits in adulthood by having a quicker pace of reproduction, which is helped by the support of their children. And so the best evidence for this theory comes from Kramer's work, which shows that even though children are not net producers, when we consider their contributions within a family, so as opposed to just their individual contributions, they actually offset a considerable amount of their cost. And then the last one is really just a null hypothesis proposed by Charnoff, which is that childhood is just a predicted outcome of the overall length of the human lifespan. So children may learn or they may cooperate during childhood, but this is not why childhood evolved. So by investigating how and when children learn in a variety of societies, we can start to amass evidence for and against these different theories. Research into childhood and learning can also help us understand cumulative cultural evolution. So we know that humans live in diverse environments, and we thrive in these different ecologies via acquired culture rather than biological adaptations. And we know that human culture is cumulative. So social transmission, this quote from Caldwell and Millen, allows for successive improvements to performance over generations of learners generated by accumulation of modifications to transmitted behaviors. So these acquired cultural aspects include both instrumental skills, so the things that help us find food in our environments, but also the conventional skills that help us cooperate. And aspects of human cognition likely evolved for cultural acquisition and high fidelity knowledge transmission. So studying how and when individuals learn can shed light on how cultures are maintained and changed over time. And I'm going to focus on some of these cognitive mechanisms, including intrinsic motivation for learning via pretense play, intrinsic motivation for learning via work, and how children learn through teaching. Okay, so why research contemporary hunter-gatherers? So in this talk, I'm going to be talking about immediate return hunter-gatherers, also known as foragers. And these communities are really interesting to the study of child development because it's the oldest human subsistence strategy and one of the most diverse. So by referring to hunter-gatherers, I'm talking about communities that are mostly mobile, though of course how much they move varies considerably across cultures. These are communities that rely on non-domesticated plants and animals for subsistence, though of course this also varies. They tend to live in small residential groups of about 45 to 100 individuals who come together and separate throughout the year. But importantly, they also have really large lifetime networks, both in terms of number of people and in terms of geographic range. Many of the cultural values that hunter-gatherers practice are really also unique in comparison to the West and in comparison to most other small-scale societies. So they tend to practice egalitarianism with little inherited status hierarchy and little status hierarchy according to age and gender. And this egalitarianism is extended to children. They tend to practice cooperative autonomy with strong taboos against coercing others, but also an autonomy that feeds into benefiting the group. And for children, this means that they really have the independence to pursue their own learning interests. And in one interview with a Bayaka adult, he said that he prefers children to do their own thing because they have their own stories, their own things to learn in the forest. And then they also practice widespread sharing of food, but also of goods, knowledge, and space. And for children, this means that they have access to diverse learning models and also to a lot of different types of knowledge. So I want to point out here that one of the most fascinating and fruitful aspects of studying hunter-gatherers is their incredible diversity. So they're diverse in technology, in where they live, in their relationship with neighbors, and their incorporation with their nation states. So we often characterize as hunter-gatherers as experiencing change now, which may not have happened in the past, but some hunter-gatherers like the Minik in Thailand have lived in a kingdom since the 1300s. And today, many of these communities live within a couple hours of a grocery store, and they still continue to choose to hunt and gather. And for many communities, hunting and gathering is a strategy that they use to overcome state hegemony. And hunting and gathering is not historically fixed. So some communities have transitioned to and from hunting and gathering as a way of life. So I just want to point this out. I don't want to fall into the trap of characterizing hunter-gatherers as unchanged from our evolutionary past. That's not at all the case. In fact, I think hunter-gatherers are just as diverse today, and they were likely even more diverse in our evolutionary past. So I don't think that studying specific communities as a model for past really can tell us that much, especially when we forget to account for complex histories. But if we systematically investigate diversity, it can help us understand variation, and for my purposes, variation into child development, which can also shed light on developmental plasticity. And I just also want to briefly say that intracultural variation is also a really important thing. I'm not going to talk about it that much, but it can help us shed light on dynamics of culture change. And as hunter-gatherer communities face market integration and increased schooling, we can actually track these changes to understand how this leads to changes in social values and beliefs about child development. So that's not something I'm doing yet, but that I hope to do in the future. So on that note, here's what we know about hunter-gatherer childhood diversity. This is from Connor's work. And this is the latest iteration of his hunter-gatherer childhoods model from data from 9 communities. And it's important to note here that these are mostly tropical or subtropical communities, which reflects just an overwhelming bias in our data on hunter-gatherers. So in terms of some similarities in childhood, these communities tend to have highly indulged infancy, and they have high rates of physical contact with mothers and other caregivers. Infants tend to be breastfed on demand, and children tend to practice child-led weaning. And when children do transition from their mother's arms, they tend to transition into a multi-age mixed-sex playgroup. But there is considerable amount of variation, especially as we get into more of that data on middle childhood and adolescence towards the far side of the table. So this is especially true for self-provisioning, for assigning chores, and for other aspects of socialization. So these things may represent more facultative adaptations to specific ecological and cultural contexts, but we don't have a lot of systematic comparisons which use the same methods to understand this variation. So that's what I did for a lot of my PhD, was try and look at this. So I worked in 2 forager communities. My main field site is with Bayaka foragers in the Republic of Congo. And these communities live in the dense tropical rainforest of the Congo Basin, and they rely on a wide variety of foraging, including fruits, tubers, fishing, hunting with spears, guns, and traps. And they also maintain horticultural gardens. And you can see in this picture, this is just like half a day's work of collecting palm nuts. And there's 2 full baskets that are going to get turned into oil. So I like to say here that that fat grows on trees in the Congo Basin. So it's a really fruitful environment to live in. And then I also worked with the Hadza. I don't think I have to say a lot because I know there are some Hadza researchers in your ranks. But for those who might be joining from somewhere else, so this is a community. They are arid savanna. They live in the arid savanna woodlands of northern Tanzania, and they subsist on honey collecting, bow and arrow hunting, collecting berries, tubers, and fruits. And increasingly, these communities rely on maize, including communities that stay in more permanent bush camps throughout the year. So in both communities, there are some cultigens that are part of their diet, and that doesn't seem to make them any less hunter-gatherers. Okay, so most of my methods are focal follows. So I collected my data over 16 months of field work, 14 months with the Bayaka, and that research is ongoing. And then I spent 2 months with the Hadza. And I primarily focused on naturalistic behavior. So I followed kids around, each kid for 4 hours, and I recorded what they were doing, where they were doing it, and who they were doing it with at 1-minute intervals. So it's a lot of very dense data. And I focused on children ranging in age from 3 to 18. So really that whole span of development when they're kind of out and about and can do their own things. I also conducted interviews with adults at the end of every day, asking them why they had foraged with kids or why they hadn't, and also asking them how they learned when they were growing up. And then I also did a lot of participant observation in both communities. I played with kids. I babysat a lot because that was really my only skill that I can contribute when moms were out and about. And then I tried to learn the best I could, the way that I saw kids learning, and received a lot of corrections. I'll say briefly that it was easier for me to do this with the Bayaka because I, after 14 months, picked up on a little bit of the language. So most of my ethnographic examples will be from the Bayaka, but I tried to pick some that matched more diverse communities as much as possible. Okay, so let's get into some data. So first I want to talk to you here about play. So we know that humans aren't the only animals who play, and play makes up a large proportion of time allocation during the juvenility of both humans and non-human mammals. So ethologists working mostly with non-human animals have developed a very functional definition of play, which I'll be using here. So play has no obvious immediate benefit. It's a voluntary, pleasurable activity. It involves movements which are exaggerated, repeated, or fragmented, and it occurs in the absence of stress. So since play is intrinsically motivated, and since, at least in humans, much of children's play emulates adult work, researchers have argued that play may be part of an evolved cultural learning psychology through which children are really motivated to participate in relevant aspects of subsistence and culture. So developmental studies, so developmental psychology studies, which mostly come from Western samples, have found that there are some consistent gender differences in both the types of play and who children play with. And so in this study, I wanted to see if these gender differences held true in a different cultural setting. So here I sampled 46 Hadza children and 65 Bayaka children using that focal follow procedure I mentioned earlier. And I think that this is a really interesting contrast because even though they're both foragers and even though children are granted similar autonomy, there's some very striking differences in terms of gendered work. So amongst the Hadza, they have a much more pronounced gender division of labor. Men do almost all of the hunting and women do almost all of the gathering. Whereas amongst the Bayaka, those roles are really different. In the picture I showed you earlier, those men were participating in gathering of palm nuts. And most of the women I've interviewed told me that they know how to hunt and that their dads taught them how to hunt, or that they check traps for their husbands. So women know how to do that activity too. And then we also know from Barry Hewlett's work that men are really active in infant caregiving, and he characterizes them as some of the most active dads in the world. So these are kind of three areas of contrast between these two communities. So here's some of the results. So I found that overall children and adolescents in the sample devoted about 25% of their time to play. So they're spending a lot of their daytime participating in this activity. And you can see here that girls' participation in play decreased significantly with age. We didn't find the same for boys. It does decrease, just not as strikingly. And I think that this reflects some cross-cultural trends of girls' earlier entry into the workforce, at least earlier than boys. So in other words, as girls are spending more time in work, they have less time to spend in play. I also found that 30 to 40% of children's play was pretense play. And by pretense play, I'm talking about play which projects a supposed situation onto an actual one in the spirit of fun. And so I want to show you what this looks like with some videos. So a content warning: in the next few slides, there's going to be some pictures of dead animals, and I'll let you know when that's done for those who might want to look away. Okay, so this group of boys, they're ranging in age from 4 to 6, were out in this greenery playing with these play spears. And I heard them making these noises and I called them to perform for the camera. So I hope you can hear this. Great. So they're making this great noise, and I was really excited because the day before I had interviewed my friend and he was showing me how they do different animal calls. And so this is the call that men use to call blue duiker when they're hunting with spears.
Shaina, can you turn up the volume on the laptop a little bit?
How's that?
Much better.
Great. So we can see that even though these kids were pretending to collect, they were actually out collecting butterflies and grasshoppers. They were actually in their play, they were saying, oh, look, there's a blue duiker. Oh, look, there's a red duiker. And then they were emulating these very specific and practical aspects of hunting. So this is some other footage. So now we're moving into work play. So this is a multi-age and a mixed-sex group of kids. And in this footage, I had asked the boys to show me how they hunt rats, and they were really excited to take me out. And I was not very convinced that they would be successful, and they proved me wrong. So here's what that looks like. So what I love about this is that this is like a group of 8 kids, and by the end of their 3-hour hunt, they got 2 rats. So that means that they're each getting like a quarter of a bite, which is not a lot of nutrition, but they're spending a lot of energy going out and collecting this food. And so here I just want to show you, this is some footage from an experiment I did in 2018 with an archaeologist who was wanted to do some experimental work on spears. And so I just want to point out here just the length of the spear and the kind of technique, because I don't know if you noticed in the past footage, but they were hunting with these super long spears, which apparently is not very common across cultures. And so the kids had these really long spears, and that's also what the adults are using. And so we can see that as kids get older, so does their prey. So they go from collecting a butterfly, which they don't eat, but are still very proud when they spear one, to these bush rats, and then to blue duiker, which is a really important food source in the Congo Basin, and one that men very regularly hunt with spears. Okay, so for those who were looking away, that's it with the gory dead animal stuff. So I also wanted to quantitatively examine this theory that pretense play helps children practice adult work. So this is data from Hadza. So it's pretense playtime by type of pretense play. And we're seeing that most children's pretense play does emulate work, and even the non-work themed emulated cultural activities. So most of what they're doing is emulating adult activities. We found some strong gender differences in pretense play, with Hadza girls allocating much more of their time to playing house, to playing foraging, and to doll play than Hadza boys, and Hadza boys allocating much more time to playing hunting than Hadza girls. And these are the same data for Bayaka. Again, we're seeing most of their time is devoted to emulating work. And we're seeing, again, some gender differences in pretense, with Bayaka girls allocating much more time to playing house than boys, and boys allocating much more time to playing hunting and playing honey collecting than girls. So I want to point out 2 interesting things here. So there were more gender differences in the pretense play of Hadza. And unlike a majority of the world's cultures, we found no gender differences in doll play among the Bayaka, while we did find those same expected gender differences amongst the Hadza. So I think what we're seeing here is that that children are imitating gender-specific behavior, but this gender-specific behavior is more importantly culturally specific. And in the case of doll play, this means that boys are also emulating doll play amongst the Bayaka because they're seeing their dads participate in this activity. So I also looked at gender segregation in play. So studies in developmental psychology overwhelmingly find that children prefer to interact with same gender peers as early as 3 years old. But anthropologists working with hunter-gatherers pretty consistently note that hunter-gatherer children play with opposite sex peers throughout the day. So it's been theorized that the demographic nature of hunter-gatherer societies, and specifically that they just don't have a lot of access to same-gendered playmates, can explain this theory, but it had never been quantitatively tested. So I tested this using a multi-level model, and I found that the number of children available in a camp was a strong predictor for play in mixed gender groups, and negative predictor, suggesting that for every additional child in camp, children were 1.03 times less likely to play in mixed gender groups. And this was independent of gender, age, and culture. So what this means is that demographic elements such as camp composition and availability of playmates influence whom children can play with, and so it likely also influences who they learn from when they're interacting with their peers. So I want to recap some of this in terms of similarities and variation. So we found some cross-cultural similarities with children spending a lot of their time in multi-age mixed-sex groups, and children's play was pretty autonomous, right? They don't have adults telling them what they should play at, but they were autonomously participating in this activity, and it was self-motivated. They were emulating work in their play by their own volition. And we also found some variation. So there were cultural differences in adult gender division of labor, which shape also gender differences in children's play. And in terms of settlement structure and particularly demography, these also shape who children spend their time with. Now, looking at some of these data on work. So there's ample research to suggest that children learn to forage by participating in economic activities alongside community members. And this participation doesn't only lead to the acquisition of skills, but also of social norms such as gender roles. And it's important to note that what children can work at depends on a variety of factors, including risks inherent to their activities and the strength and skill of collecting specific resources. And some of the best research on this is from the 80s and 90s, which compared Hadza and San children's foraging and showed that potentially risks inherent to the environment, such as getting lost and dehydration, explained why San children didn't forage all that much and Hadza children did. So in this study, I wanted to compare children's participation in work activities. And I wanted to also look at who they were with while they were working and how adults justified when they did and didn't forage with children. So this is the same exact sample as before, and the same focal follows, and in addition to some interviews with adults. So overall, we found that children and adolescents were spending about 25% of their time in work in both societies. So this was pretty much exactly what they were doing in terms of play. And we're also finding very similar gender differences between cultures when it comes to play. So Hadza girls are gathering more and they're doing more tuber digging, and Hadza boys are doing more honey collecting and hunting and trapping. And the only difference we're seeing for the Bayaka is in terms of these household chores. So we also found some cross-cultural variation in time spent in different activities. So Hadza children, and this was primarily boys, participated in more honey collecting, and they also spent less time in proximity to adults, about 37% of their work time, and less time interacting with adults, about 19% of their work time, compared to Bayaka. So what's important to note here is that when I was collecting data with the Hadza, boys were really occupied with collecting kanoa, which is a type of honey from stingless bees. And so it's very easy for children to collect this. It's not very high off the ground. You just need to be strong enough to pick up a machete and cut down some of these shrubs. And so I think what we're seeing here is that children are making the best of a small situation by helping when they can. And so because they can go out and collect these foods, they're going out in child-only groups to do it. Amongst the Bayaka, we're seeing that children are just doing much more household work. And during this season where I was collecting data, Bayaka kids had much fewer opportunities to go out collecting food independently. Not no opportunities, but much fewer. So instead, children spent a lot more of their time doing household chores, and this reflects the incredible amount of food processing Bayaka do. From 2 p.m. until the nighttime, like it's just boiling, scraping, pounding. It's just women's work nonstop. And so children were participating in these activities, and because lots of household chores are done in camp, they were spending more time in proximity to adults, so about 61% of their work time, and they were interacting with adults more at around 30% of their work time. So while there were some significant cross-cultural differences in time spent with or near adults, it's important to note here that children in both communities spent a minority of their daytime work interacting with adults, so 19 to 29%. So again, we're seeing this autonomy. And then we also found that adults cited a number of reasons for not foraging with kids. So this included things like distance, that the foraging patch was way too far, that children were just bad at walking, and that's something I heard in both communities over and over, or that children were too slow. It also included things like danger, so inclement weather, either high or low temperature, elephants, lack of food, having to walk through deep waters or climbing on rocks. A lot of adults said that that's why they didn't take kids to forage with them. They also talked about autonomy. So either that children were occupied doing other things, or that the adults themselves just didn't feel like foraging with kids that day. And also that kids they can get in the way of the hunt. So they get fussy, they want food, or they scare off animals. And actually only Hadza men noted this. And then there are a lot of reasons why parents said that they did want kids to forage with them. So that just involved things like company. They just wanted to be with other people, or the fact that there was just nobody to leave kids in camp with, so they rather take them with them. Again, autonomy, that children had decided to follow them, even if they didn't necessarily want them to come foraging with them. They also said that they took children to teach them, to impart knowledge. And also for help, that they needed somebody to hold a baby or to show them where they had found where the child had found a resource the day before, or things like starting fires or making pegs, just helping them do these subsistence activities. So this has been a long laundry list, but I just want to summarize here. So there are risks to children and to foraging success, and these were often cited reasons for not foraging with children. But when children and adults did forage together, it was for cooperation. So teaching, company, and help, including children's self-initiation to go out and forage with adults. So coming back to these similarities and these differences, again, we're seeing that, like in play, children's foraging is mostly done autonomously from adults, and we're seeing that children are self-motivated to participate in foraging where they can. And then in terms of differences, we're seeing again this effect of gender division of labor. We're also seeing that the availability of relatively low skill and low strength work shapes what children participate in. And then we're also seeing that ecological risks may constrain how much and with whom children forage, which echoes these findings from the 80s and 90s. So the explanation for these cross-cultural differences here are primarily post hoc. I did not have hypotheses. I just tried to explain what I found, and they're primarily descriptive. So in the next thing I'm going to show you, I wanted to see if we could actually measure, predict these trends using a much bigger sample. So this is an ongoing study of time allocation data on extrinsic correlates for cross-cultural variation in hunter-gatherer children's time allocation. So this is a large collaboration with a lot of great researchers, which has been a really fun project to be working on. And this includes focal follows and scan samples from 690 children from 12 societies ranging in age from 3 to 18. And it's a strength and a weakness of this study that we have one kind of northern latitude forager community with only 15 kids, but it's still something. And we looked at 4 comparable categories, because obviously these were data that weren't collected for this project. So we had to kind of summarize in comparable chunks. So we looked at childcare, food production, domestic work, and play. And then the reference category, so the 5th kind of shadow category, which is everything else. And we wanted to really measure specifically this variation. So we wanted to answer 3 central questions. So first, how are gender differences in child and adolescent time allocation influenced by adult gender division of labor? And we measured gender division of labor as a proportion male and female adults contribute to overall daily caloric returns. And these were ethnographer estimates, and we standardized these between -2 and 2. And we expected greater gender differences in time allocation in societies where men's contributions to the diet were greater. We also looked at how ecological risk influences children's time allocation. So we looked at 2 things. We looked at dangerous mammal density. So we define this as the types of animals children could encounter by mistake. So not things that would maybe injure you when you're hunting them. So things like elephants, hippos, big cats, wolves. And originally this was going to be a continuous variable, but then just because of African elephants, there was just a very natural split in the data. So we just divided them into low and high. And then we also looked at water quality and quantity, which was ranked on a 1 to 5 scale. And we expected children and adolescents to work less in ecology where the risk of encountering dangerous mammals and of dehydration were greater. And then the third thing, which I'm actually not going to talk about, are climatic variables that we also looked at, but those findings are a bit more complex and not as relevant to the point I'm trying to make. So I'm just going to leave those out. And then we looked at these using multi-level behavioral models very thankful for that paper by Jeremy Koster and Richard McElrath for doing all the hard work in the types of models that are needed to analyze these data. So this is nothing that you shouldn't expect, but we saw increased gender differences or increased sex differences throughout childhood and adolescence in all activities. So we're seeing here that girls are doing more childcare as they age, and they're doing more domestic work, and boys are doing more food production and doing more play across the board. And we're not seeing many gender differences in the reference category. So this isn't any new fancy stuff, but it's a good sign that mixing up all these data is yielding some kind of regular results. So this is a bit more interesting. So we found that sex differences increased in societies that were male biased. So you can see that in the second plot. So this was strongest for childcare. So boys in societies where men did most of the work did basically no childcare. So there are two processes which I think may result in this finding, and they're not mutually exclusive. The first, that in societies where men play a larger role in food production, they might just allocate less time to direct caretaking. And so boys may just have fewer opportunities to observe this behavior and to emulate it. And then another thing that might be going on is that in these societies where men are doing more work, there's just a more segregation of social space, and boys are less likely to be close to their moms, who then might not be assigning this task to them as much. So there's some work to be done here in digging into the kind of processes that lead to this, but I'm still kind of excited that we're finding more quantitatively that these gender differences are contingent on adult behavior. And then here's the data on risk. So we found that children in riskier environments were less likely to participate in childcare and domestic work. So this is, again, exciting because it matches what we had predicted. But we did not find a strong effect of these for food production, which was a surprise because we expected it. So there might be a few potential reasons. So childcare and domestic work are activities that are pretty low strength and low skill. So it might be just that safety is that main barrier that keeps children from participating in it. Whereas many food production activities like tuber digging or honey collecting or large game hunting, these just require more strength and skill. So by the time kids are able to participate in these activities, they've also figured out how to navigate the ecological risks associated with them. So it just might be a case of learning. It also could be that because we don't have data on group composition, that there's some mediating effect of who children are foraging with. So it could be that in riskier environments, children go out foraging with adults more often, whereas in safer environments, children go out foraging with children. So it might not be about how much time, but about who they're spending that time with. And then also important to note here is we were measuring time allocation here, but it might be that foraging returns would have been a more direct way to check out this variation. So these are very much work in progress data. So I welcome any feedback that you might have. And we're hoping to get this ready to go in the next couple months. So revisiting our growing list, so we're adding to the support here that gender division of labor affects the ontogeny of gender differences in childhood. And then we're also seeing, again, that ecological risk influences variation in children's time allocation to certain types of work. And then now I want to tell you the kind of last study I want to present before I wrap this up, a little bit about teaching. So here again, I'm following ethologists as defining teaching as a teacher modifying their behavior to enhance learning in another individual, as not the byproduct of another activity, and as involving sensitivity between the teacher and the learner. And so we know that from an evolutionary perspective, teaching is costly because unlike observational learning, where the learner's doing all the work and the model's going about living their life, teaching actually requires coordination between both the teacher and the learner. But that coordination is actually beneficial because the teacher can call attention to relevant stimuli, and this can help the learner avoid mistakes that they might make otherwise. And so as a result, it can lead to a more accurate knowledge transmission. So it's been hypothesized that teaching evolved to facilitate the transmission of complex and opaque knowledge on which humans rely. And there's some debate in the ethnographic literature, so many qualitative studies, which define teaching more from what it looks like in school as teaching being really rare in many small scale societies, whereas more quantitative studies, which tend to use this more ethological definition, which includes this kind of didactic instructions, but isn't limited to it, they argue that teaching does occur, but that it just looks different. And so considering the amount of time children are spending with other children, I wanted to know whether some of this variability comes from peer teaching. So we know that children's teaching skill increases as they age from developmental research. So By 1 year of age, children can identify a knowledge gap in another individual, and by 9 to 10 years, they can actually change their teaching based on what they think the learner knows. And then children are also within each other's zone of proximal development. So developmental researchers define this as the distance between what a child can accomplish on their own and what they can accomplish with help. And so because child teachers were very recently the learners, they can remember all the steps involved in the acquisition of that knowledge, and so they can scaffold that acquisition, whereas an adult who just has much more distance between themselves and that learning experience might have a harder time of remembering what goes into learning. So from an evolutionary theory perspective, we've talked a lot about teaching from parents specifically because it enhances inclusive fitness, but siblings are just as related to each other as our parents. And you also can only ever have a maximum of 2 parents, but you can have many, many siblings. So you can share that cost more evenly. And then there are some direct benefits to teaching your siblings. So having more siblings is a risk because it means you have a smaller share of that great food that your parents are bringing back. So if you're teaching your younger sibling to get out and get some of that food on their own, you can actually stake a bigger share of what the adults are bringing back just by helping your younger sibling with that self-provisioning. And then finally, from a cultural evolutionary perspective, who children learn from should change throughout their development. So younger children should learn less costly things, more basic skills by learning with their friends. And then as they grow up, they can seek and update their knowledge by seeking out more expert adults. So there are kind of 3 lines of reasoning as to why we should see peer teaching, and that's what I wanted to explore. So these are the behaviors I coded as teaching, and they're from previous studies. Like I said, this includes things like classroom instruction, but also many more subtle forms of teaching like demonstration, teasing, and task assignment. And in this study, I also focused on the teaching of subsistence skills specifically because this is observable, and subsistence skills, you just need them to survive. So in this study, I considered all individuals living in a camp at the time of data collection, so both children and adults, as potential teachers. And then I cross-referenced their identities with some demographic information about age, gender, and kinship relationship to the focal children. And then I conducted, and I'll just say briefly that these focal follows were done with an interpreter who is translating what was said to and from the focal child. So it's really high coverage. And then I did a social network analysis, specifically a social relations model, which is really good for egocentric data, which these focal follows were, and allow me to look at this demographic information of the relationship of the teacher and the learner and this dyadic information. So qualitatively, let me tell you that 75% of the teaching directed to children, to all my focal children, were by individuals under the age of 18. And this was in both societies, and it was independent of how much time they were in proximity to adults. So we're seeing that peer teaching of these subsistence skills were really the norm. Here are some model results. So we're seeing a strong quadratic effect of teachers' age. So children's teaching, so they were teaching more as they aged. And this is really consistent with the fact that as they age, they know more, and the fact that as they age, they're just developing this teaching skill. What I didn't expect so much was for teaching to decrease after 35. That was a bit of a surprise. And I think that this may have to do with alloparental care that children are doing in the form of teaching of their siblings, of their cousins, and of others. So we know that in these communities, by the time adults are in their mid-30s, they usually have multiple children. And so they're very busy foraging and very busy taking care of their children. So it could be that when they're off doing those things, their older children or just other kids in the community are taking over some of that burden of teaching, and in that way are offsetting some of their own costs and are contributing to the family economy. We also found a strong interaction between rates of sibling teaching in society. So Hadza sibling dyads were more likely to experience teaching than Bayaka sibling dyads. And I think, again, this is a post hoc kind of trying to understand what's going on here, but I think that this may reflect some ecological differences in camp structure. So In the environment the Bayaka live in is just a dense forest, and any camp, you're actually cutting it out of the forest. So the camps tend to be really, really small. And so from any point in camp, you can see everybody else. Like you can never be alone in camp. Whereas in Hadza camps, and specifically the ones I worked in, there's just more room. And so for more permanent camps, it's meant that they were a bit more sprawling. And so a lot of times when I was following children in camp, there were actually no adults in visible range. So I think what we're seeing here is that there's a kind of teach when the parent is absent strategy. When your parent is there, you kind of let your parent do the teaching. But if your parent's not there, then you're going to take over that teaching of your sibling. And then we're just seeing a fuller effect of this amongst the Hadza just because they're spending less time in proximity to adults. And then finally, we found a strong interaction between the age of the teacher, the age of the learner, and the community. So Bayaka children were more likely to be taught by other children when they were younger, this line in red in the second half of this figure. And then adolescents were more likely to be taught by adults here in green. And this trend is pretty spot on with what we know about a multi-stage learning model where children are gaining basic competencies from peers in their younger years and then from adults later on. But we're not seeing this amongst the Hadza, and I think that this is pretty interesting. So I think that this has to do with different socialization practices. So from a very young age, Hadza children are made fully functioning bows and digging sticks, and they're expected to go out to use these tools, and to produce food with these tools. And so this may facilitate earlier practice, which reduces the need for adult teaching later on. Amongst the Bayaka, children are also made tools, but they don't use them as much and they tend to be not very functional. And so I think what we're seeing here is that these early opportunities for practice and in a way, a type of teaching, right, of adults giving children tools for them to use is offsetting the need for teaching later on. And revisiting this list, so we're again seeing this child autonomy in terms of similarities, and then in terms of variation, we're seeing that again, settlement structure may influence who children can learn from, and we're also seeing that these early socialization practices affect work availability, which may influence how children and how they learn and who they learn from as they grow. Okay, so I'm going to come back around now to what this means for our understanding of human evolution. So first, I just want to highlight the most important thing, which I'm just reminding myself over and over again as I do this research, is that how children learn and how much they learn is much more facultative adaptations to specific ecological and cultural contexts. And as I've highlighted at the beginning of the talk, hunter-gatherers are incredibly diverse. And they were probably much more so in our past as well. So this diversity means that there is unlikely to be one hunter-gatherer childhood, but several. And so we've likely evolved these highly flexible childhoods which easily respond to our environments. So how children learn, either through on-the-job training or through play, is dependent on these extrinsic factors like social opportunities, gendered work, and also ecological risks. And while I haven't talked about this as much, it's also, of course, dependent on intrinsic factors like motivation, skill, and strength. And these are questions I hope to look at more in the future. So I can't actually say much about whether or not childhood evolved for sure as a period for learning or cooperation. So these are, of course, open questions, but I want to make two interventions here. So first, my data do suggest that childhood is a time for learning, but it also suggests it's a time for transmitting knowledge to peers by playing together, working together, and teaching together. And as my colleagues in psychology often remind me, teaching can often lead to a deepening knowledge acquisition in the teacher themselves, so the two are not necessarily mutually exclusive. You can learn through teaching. I've also shown that much of children's learning is cooperative. It's done in groups, and wherever possible, children opt for on-the-job learning to benefit their families, either directly through food production or indirectly through other work tasks. So when considering life history trade-offs associated with learning, my data suggests that we should also consider the costs and benefits of peer learning to individuals and to their families. So learning with peers may be adaptive because it has the potential to increase children's inclusive and individual fitness by offsetting their own and other people's costs of care, especially their siblings. And because children can facilitate each other's knowledge acquisition in the zone of proximal development, child-to-child transmission may contribute to more rapid and potentially less costly knowledge transfers, especially of basic skills. So the question I'm kind of left with is it possible that some of the costs associated with long childhoods are offset by peer learning? And this is an outstanding question I look to explore. I'm looking forward to exploring empirically and through some modeling studies in the future. And then I think these findings also have implications for cumulative cultural evolution. So I love this quote by Serbi and Parisi from their 2006 modeling study, where they say, any kind of evolutionary process needs two mechanisms to operate: a mechanism for selective reproduction and a mechanism that constantly adds new variability. Intragenerational transmission, so this peer learning, adds new variability. And I think this really summarizes current thinking in cultural evolution. And I think what I'm excited about here is that my data shows that intragenerational transmission can also lead to cultural continuity in hunter-gatherer societies. So here's my thinking on this, and this is very much still a thought experiment for me. So I, again, welcome feedback. So we know that hunter-gatherers rely on non-domesticated resources that shift in availability and in abundance seasonally, yearly, and across generations. So behavioral flexibility and innovation and kind of learning mechanisms that promote these may help mitigate these communities against the resource fluctuation of associated with these resources. So when environments are the same, intracultural transmission can result in children coming upon the kind of same or similar solutions to their parents. But when environments change from one generation to the next, this horizontal transmission between peers can actually lead to culture change. So in other words, what I think is happening is that hunter-gatherer transmission mechanisms have evolved to promote this flexibility, and that peer transmission, which is again promoted by this value of autonomy, is part of this package of hunter-gatherer resilience. And I've talked mostly about cultural continuity, but I just briefly want to tell you what this culture change looks like. So an example all the way at the edge here from the ethnographic record. So Camilla Morelli's work with the Matsés in the Amazon is a really good example of how children can lead to culture change. So she showed that, so this is a community of forager horticulturalists that were recently settled. And so even though these communities were settled near rivers, adults continued to go off into the forest basically every day to collect forest resources. But children, granted this autonomy, spent most of their day playing by the river, which is an activity adults didn't do. And so they developed effective relationships to the river, and they also developed some skills associated with living by the river, including fishing and paddling boats. And I think the quote that really struck me from Morelli's work is that older people would ask her if her dad was a good hunter, and then children would ask her if her parents had a motorboat. So there'd been this change in their orientation towards these natural resources. I also really liked this study by Sandrine Gallois, who works with the Baka in Cameroon. And she showed that children hunt rats, fish, and birds that adults don't collect, and that children had distinct names and ecological knowledge for these species, and that these names reflected words in French and in Nzime, which is the local farmer language. And so these were two languages that children were interacting with more because they'd recently been sedentarized. So it was leading to maybe a different understanding of the ecological world. And then here you see a bunch of blurred out faces, because this is from a study that myself and my colleague Sarah Pope did, which is currently under review, where we gave kids a novel material, so pipe cleaners, and then we just let them go at it and see what they made with it. And we saw that children invented all kinds of things, headbands, bracelets, anklets, necklaces, hair accessories, just all kinds of things in their free play. So children were really quick to innovate new aesthetic objects with these novel materials. So these are just some of the examples I think are out there about how hunter-gatherer children may lead to changing culture when they're interacting with new ecological or social environments. There's still a lot to do on these questions. So here are just some questions I look forward to discussing with you, and I hope that we can get behind researching. So one question is whether or not children and hunter-gatherer children specifically retain knowledge transmitted by peers better than knowledge from adults. there's some work to be done there, whether or not that acquisition really is more efficient. I'm also curious to know what agency learners have in terms of knowledge transmission. So how do they actually instigate teaching? Do aspects of children's cultures, the things that they invent, actually, are they transmitted upwards to adults? What role do adolescents have in culture change? We know very little about what adolescents are doing really anywhere, and especially in smaller scale societies. And then I'm curious to know how subsistence strategy buffers the effect of ecological risk on children's time allocation. So when you're moving around with your food, in the case of pastoralists, or when you put your food there and it stays there, in the case of agriculturalists, do environmental risks matter as much to children's work? And then, as I mentioned before, what intrinsic factors are influencing children's time allocation? And specifically in terms of motivation, we haven't done a lot of work looking at why within communities, some kids just collect more food than others. And then a quick plug here, a lot of these ideas and some of this research comes out through Forager Child Studies, which is my research group. We are a ragtag team of interdisciplinary scholars interested in forager children's lives, past, present, and future. And so we conduct reviews on how children learn, on the archaeology of hunter-gatherer children, and things like schooling and the psychology of children. And so please do check out our work. And if you would like to join us because you're excited about, you are doing research like this, or you want to do research like this, please shoot me an email, because we'd love to tag you in and have you join us. So thank you to the Haas and Bayaka families that continue to share their time with me. Many of the photos and videos here are courtesy of my colleague, Sarah. And many of the Haas photos are by Alyssa Crittenden. And then I have a lot of great collaborators, and I've been lucky to be supported by a lot of great organizations, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sheina, for an amazing talk. That was fantastic. So much to think about there. Really, really cool findings, and such rich descriptions of especially the differences between the places where you work is really, really, really cool. So let me open the floor for Q&A. Anyone who would like to ask a question, the preferred method is the so-called blue hand, the raise hand option under participants, and I'll keep a list and call on people in order. So first we have a question from Sasha.
Hi, Sheina. Thank you for the great talk. So I'm very interested in like evolution of play, and especially play in animals. And I was wondering, I'm not sure if you said this, but like how often did you see in your play types, like just rough and tumble play, like not really cultural, practicing of cultural activities, but like something that might be more comparable to, play fighting in primates or something like that. And then I guess as like more speculative thing, I was wondering about how you did see a lot of like children emulating adults and like sort of very culturally specific behaviors, like you said, and I was thinking more about like the mechanism of that. And do you think like there's something about children need to see those behaviors in adults and then they are just emulating them during play, and whether that's like maybe more common in other types of play, like even in animals, like seeing some sort of adult behavior is the mechanism for practicing during play, rather than what we typically think of animal behavior is like, it's just some sort of developmental, like sort of somewhat more, I guess I should say, more like nurture versus nature effect. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, so I'll touch on the rough and tumble first. So we did look at rough and tumble play. And so there'd been a bunch of research in hunter-gatherer society suggesting that kids didn't do a lot of rough and tumble play. And then there'd also been some research among the Maya, which showed that in communities where there was more violence, kids engaged in more rough and tumble play than in communities where there wasn't as much. So we looked at rough and tumble play, and we did find a significant cross-cultural difference, with Bayaka children engaging in not a lot, whereas Hadza children did engage in much more rough and tumble play, which I think just has more to do with discipline practices in both these communities. But we also found that adolescents, there was a significant interaction between gender and age. So adolescents engaged in much more rough and tumble play, and adolescent boys. So I think they're just showing off a little bit more. So there is some comparability, but I think there's more cultural variability there. In terms of the mechanisms, I think it's true that kids are emulating what adults are doing, but they're also emulating what the other kids are doing. So it's a bit hard to maybe disentangle those, but I think there's a good example from Colin Turnbull from the Embodied, where these kids had observed a fight, and then they were emulating that fight in their pretense, but then they resolved the fight in a different way. So they're also riffing off of these what they're observing and coming up with their own solutions, which I think is also part of that culture change and decision-making thing. But yeah, I think it's a really important question. And I think if I could bring eye trackers to the field and see, who kids are looking at while they're doing these activities, I think it would be really cool to see who they're paying attention to, because it might be that they are learning and working and teaching with each other, but they're spending a lot more time watching adults, and that's just really hard to do in a focal follow. I tried to keep track of it, and then I just had to throw it all out because it was so inconsistent. So yeah, thanks for your question.
Thanks. And I don't know if I have time to ask one other play question, but I was also wondering about so I think you said the play was higher in the riskier ecologies in your time allocation study.
There was
that's significant.
No, there wasn't a strong effect of ecology on play, but it would have been cool if there was, because it would have meant they were practicing more, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering, it looked like it was maybe slightly higher on the graph, but yeah, because I guess I would expect, based on animal research, that play would be lower in a riskier ecology, just because the risk of playing is greater. Like you're saying, children have more autonomy, and they're off maybe getting into trouble or finding these dangerous mammals or something.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, it would be interesting. With only 12 societies, only the strongest of strong effects could be picked up, I think, but it would be interesting for sure to dig into that more. Yeah, thanks.
Great, thank you. Next in the queue, we have Dan.
Hey, Shaina, really interesting. Thank you. And my question / comment actually articulates with one that Molly Fox put in the chats because she had to leave. In the West, a sort of striking feature, well, the two striking features of childhood, really, one is the age segregated nature of children's experiences. And the other is the culture of childhood, where there seems to be cultural transmission of information that adults either forget or only vaguely remember from their childhood, but it's clear that children are learning it from other children. And that seems constant over very long periods of time, centuries, right? So I'm curious whether you see any evidence of something like a culture of childhood, right? Ideas that are, whether they're games, rhymes, or, fantasies, nightmares, what have you, that really are unique to children, right? And whether there's any articulation between that and the degree of what you might think of as pragmatic information transmission.
Yeah. So first of all, I'll say that these child cultures transmission, we've really overlooked that, especially from a cultural evolutionary standpoint. There's one 2010 study by Marin, which is in French, which shows an incredible amount of continuity. And he argues that it's actually how easy it is to imitate these children's cultures that keeps them living for a long time. Of course, we're seeing that also in the Bayaka community. I can speak more to them, but there's games that look a lot like playing jacks to me. They play tag. There's something, when we were growing up, we played jump rope, that round one where you go in and out, and they play a game just like that, and also the other jump rope. And I think probably most of you who've done fieldwork have seen some of these play in other communities. So yeah, I think there is a lot of peer transmission. I think a difference amongst the Bayaka especially is that adults still play these games and they play with kids. And so there's a little bit less of a segregation between what adults are doing and what kids are doing. which also reflects less of the age segregation, because if we think of adolescents, right, when they were younger kids, they were playing with adolescents who are now adults, and the adolescents now are playing with kids who then are going to become adolescents. So there's just a lot more, it stays a lot more. And I think I forgot the second part of your question. I'm sorry, or did I answer it?
Well, so you did address that, and what I was asking about was the articulation between the culture of children and the sort of pragmatic skill sets that and information that are being transmitted. I would add maybe, and it might be worth expanding the scope of your comparative cross-cultural project to include a wide variety of societies, and critically, the invention of new, components of cultures of childhood. So the community that I worked in southwestern Sumatra, I don't know whether the kids invented it or they learned it from other kids outside of the village, but they knew how to make. They suddenly learned how to make cat bombs out of old spark plugs. And this was a fad that went on for about, 6 months or a year, where all the boys were making them, and the adults didn't know how to do it. So it was clear, unambiguous peer transmission, and those kinds of, maybe, focal examples, right, that give you greater clarity than, well, everything's always been this way, and these are skills that adults know, and so on. It makes it harder to disentangle the different modes of transmission.
Yeah, I think I'm seeing Alyssa's face because she just happens to be right in the center of my screen, and so it just reminded me that Hadza kids do have some subsistence skills that only kids do and that adults don't do, which are these weaver bird traps. And then Bayaka also makes slingshots out of rubber, because rubber is grows wild there. So they make balls and they make slingshots and they go hunt birds. And I've seen adults get excited at doing this when they were bored and then go out and they're like, this is really important work, to come back with a tiny little songbird that nobody really eats. But these are really technologies that stay, within kids. And I think I just want to add another thing, which is that I've been trying to think about children's cultures also as a repository of information that is no longer part of the dominant culture. So Bayaka kids hunt with little crossbows. Adults historically hunted with crossbows, but they don't do so anymore. Japanese researchers who work with the sun also talk about little spears that kids use, and adults don't hunt with spears there anymore. So I think that it can also be a repository for keeping certain cultural knowledge alive. And then if something happens, then you can kind of make use of that knowledge again if you need it. And it tends to be for really easy to access resources like small game, which are maybe they're not big packages, but you know for sure you can find them over and over again. So I think those are some of the examples maybe where we're seeing some of that difference, or we're seeing a forgetting in adults that hasn't happened in kids, and that kids are keeping them alive. And I keep pitching these innovation studies to people working across cultures, and it has to be longitudinal, and so it's really expensive. So I've written a couple grants and tried to get money for this, and I haven't been successful yet. But hopefully in the future something like this can come up. Yeah.
Thank you.
Really interesting, and I hope that there are some granting agencies that are watching the video right now, and we'll take note of that. I'm going to leave Molly's comment for the end, since she's not here, but we can talk about that if we have time at the end. So next in the question queue, I have Brian.
Hi, Shaina, and thank you for that really wide-ranging and informative talk. I love all the work that you're doing on this subject, and the community you're organizing to do this research. It's so important. I was wondering if you could perhaps drill down a little bit in some of the data that you've been collecting on the frequency of teaching across age. So this is another great innovation of your work, is that you're quantifying things that haven't really been really put down and established in a comprehensive way across different societies. So you did have a plot showing the frequency of teaching across child age, where you showed a representation of the probability of the number of teaching events across the age of the teacher. I was wondering if you could just walk us through those data a little bit and tell us, you know, where were those data, like, it wasn't quite clear what they were based on necessarily. If you could just perhaps
share my screen with you here. Share screen. And let's see, this one, yeah, this one. Yeah, so basically, I had these kind of long lists of focal follows, and I had recorded any teaching that was happening to or from the focal child. And so I turned these so that they were all in the same direction, right? So that it was always going from the teacher to the learner. And then why we're seeing these really low frequencies, which they are pretty low, is because there's a large camp. And so, and then I only observed kids for like a relatively short period of time, right? So this is just showing just the age of the teacher and the predicted number of teaching events, and pooled for both Bayaka and Hadza in this case. And obviously I think there's a lot of interactions that may be happening here, but with only a small sample, in this case of about 35 and 38 kids, respectively in each community, we couldn't really get into that very much. But yeah, does that answer your question? So this is a quadratic effect. We also had a linear effect, which wasn't.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if I'm reading it correctly, because this is the age of the teacher on the x-axis. So yeah. you were following children, but you would pick up events in which older teachers were feeding information.
Yeah, so this is important. So there was an offset for whether or not, for how much time each individual was observed. And so how much time I could observe a potential teaching interaction, which was basically how many focal observations I had. So for example, if I saw a focal kid teach somebody else who'd never been observed, then there would be like a 0 for the other kid, and then you know, whatever, 235 for the focal kid of like what proportion. So it's just like sorry, I should have also said this is like a Poisson regression. So it's a count of how much teaching occurred between any dyads living in the camp at the time of data collection. So there's a lot of zeros in there, which is a persistent problem with all my social network data. It's just a zero party.
So is this model predicting though that, for example, the predicted number of daily teaching events would be 0.005 per day if you were around that, if you're 35 years old?
Yeah, but between like the probability of a teacher of any of these ages teaching any other individual.
Oh, okay. So it's not just teaching in general, but it's teaching between two specific dyads.
In this case, it was
two individuals.
Yeah. So in this case, it was a teacher of a specific age teaching any individual in the camp. And then with the interactions that I showed later on in these plots, it was, you know, teaching a kid of a specific age. So yeah, does that answer your question? It's been a couple years between me and this paper, so I'd have to.
Is it? I mean, if you have a rate of teaching of 0.005 per day, that's about once per year or once and a half a year.
But it's within specific dyads, right? So, and also I'll say, like, these data are noisy because I can repeatedly observe kids. So with more coverage, I think we would pick up a little bit of a better signal.
Yeah.
That's definitely one of the limitations of this.
Well, it's really fantastic that you're putting this work out there and getting this whole field going. So thanks for sharing all this with us.
Thanks. And I can revisit the paper and try and answer more succinctly and clearly over email if that's helpful.
Sure, thanks.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and it's great to know a little bit, to use your work to learn a little bit about how to do the stats on this stuff, because it seems like—
Don't use my work, but I can guide you towards the people that I say to do a better job.
I think it'll be useful for a lot of the people here. Pretty innovative stat stuff. Let me next go to Susan, who is the next in the line.
Hi, great talk. I do all this kind of stuff in capuchin monkeys. And so it's really nice to see something pretty comparable coming out with humans with rather similar methods. So so you've already investigated how partner availability can influence who can learn from whom, but I'm wondering whether you can, so controlling for demonstrator availability, determine whether learners are seeking demonstrators of a particular age or whatever other characteristics for particular skills that they're trying to learn. Because I find that both the skill type and the age difference seems to matter a lot in my population. So for example, I found in capuchins that although in general, capuchins attend more to older individuals, that the younger they are, the greater the gap in age, and the more likely they're going to seek social information in general and incorporate it into their next move. And then there was one other thing I was thinking about in your talk. I suspect very much in my data that young foragers sometimes just don't have the size and strength to effectively use the adult level technique. And so it may not be just lack of availability of those parents, but they can't do it the way mom and dad do it. They're too little, they aren't strong enough. And so really the optimum model for them would be someone maybe a year or two older who has more experience, but is more similar in the kinds of skills that they could perform at an efficient rate.
Yeah, I think those are two really excellent points. And I'm looking forward in a next study to kind of drill down into those skill specific things, which is a bit difficult because everything is everything else, right? There's so much overlap in a skill that you use for one thing applying to something else. So I'm still trying to think through what that would look like. But I think we would observe a lot of the things you're talking about. And I'm also reminded by your example about just how a kid would do something would maybe be better for another kid. There's a really interesting experimental archaeology study done with a kid where basically the adult demonstrator was showing this napping technique and then the kid just like wasn't getting it. And so he actually innovated a whole different type of napping technique, which they'd seen in the archaeological record. So I think a lot of those changes and those innovations, and I'm happy to send, I know that you also work a lot on innovation. So yeah, right. I try and dig out that paper somewhere in a reference list somewhere. But I thought that was a really excellent example of how kids, when they're solving kid-sized problems, come up with new solutions, which it might matter to the innovation itself, but it might also just matter to the process of innovating and to the learning to innovate, which then they take with them in adulthood. So I think it's both the product and the process that matters.
Yeah, that sounds great. I know you mentioned, I was like Brian, having just a little trouble as your talk went by kind of fast to visualize what each data point was. But one thing that I found useful in my own work, I know you said the gaze direction is hard, but what I did, and just in case it's useful to you in future data collection, is if I have a focal, then I define a distance. Like whenever there's another forager doing whatever behaviors I'm interested in, I then just score that is happening and just record whether the focal looked at all to that activity or just ignored it. I don't know if that's something you can do or would be useful, but
yeah,
that just enabled me to do some things that I couldn't just by using rates without without trying to control for amount of observation time for a particular demonstrator in a particular skill.
How did you manage when there were kind of multiple foragers together? Because that is one issue that we have is like people really don't do things alone. And so it's really hard to know who exactly they're looking at or whether they're just looking at the group or whether they're just looking in that direction, but not really paying attention.
Yeah, well, that reminds me, I have one advantage you probably don't is that we work in teams.
Right.
So, I can be watching the focal and then my data collection partner can be looking at recording things about the audience. So usually I am able to get all of that. I might miss a really quick glance, but I wouldn't miss a real look at the activity that would be, informative of a technique. So I just sort of score it as 1-0 because capuchins do everything fast. and this activity happened within this body length during this 10-minute follow, and they either did look at it or they didn't look at it. So it's pretty simple.
Yeah.
I mean, if it's a really sustained activity and your focal follows are really long, you might not want to just 1-0 it, but, you know, have duration of the activity and frequency of gaze during that or something like that. But
yeah, thanks. That's really helpful. I'll definitely try and look up where you've done that and see if I can replicate it. That would be
yeah, we should exchange publications. It sounds like we have a lot of similar interests. Yeah.
Cool, great. Next, let's take a question from Brooke.
Hey, Shaina, really lovely talk. It's been just so much fun watching this whole project develop over time. So, I mean, my question is sort of in the same vein of Susan's, of thinking about scoring these things and understanding what's happening. And I've only tried to do focal follows that have looked at teaching just like kind of for fun a handful of times. And one of the things that I found to be a sort of hindrance was that I needed to, like, my level of knowledge about the activity was significantly less than even like a small Marty child, for example. And so I noticed one day I was out, just to give you sort of an example of this, right? And I was following an older woman and her grandkids were there. And as she was walking and she was foraging for one thing, she would just, with her digging stick, like knock on certain bushes. She wouldn't look at them. She was just walking and she would just like swing her stick a certain way. But I asked her, like, I happened to ask her about it, and she said that, yeah, she was pointing out to them, like, those are the bushes that might have a good grub in them. And so she was indicating to the kids, like, they should stop there and look. But honestly, I would not have had the first clue that there was a teaching event happening, except that I happened to ask, and who knows how many more I can't tell you about because I just missed them completely, right? And so I'm just trying to, like, it's always sort of been something I've thought about when trying to think about how to accurately get at the amount of teaching that's happening. And it sort of comes back to Brian's point too about, right, it seems like there's this really low rate, and it's hard to know whether that might be in part just because these things are happening at such a subtle nonverbal level that that we might not capture them as researchers, but the kids might be picking them up.
I think that is an issue that is difficult with kind of all of the teaching literature. I kind of by accident, so I started doing my focal follows with an interpreter because my participants thought that it was very strange that I was hanging out alone, like, and then so they would send people to come and sit with me because they thought I was being like that, something I was unwell. And so I started doing my focal follows with an interpreter just to be like, no, I'm busy, kind of thing. And then once he started translating for me, I picked up on so much more that was happening that was really subtle, both verbal and nonverbal. And that really helped me. And so comparing, Adam and I have done this, looked at the rates of teaching that he observed in a very similar community and the rates of teaching I observed. And I just observed a lot more because I had a translator who was pointing this stuff out. So things like once this girl was like running up a hill with another girl, and there was like a little, you know, those like little sapling pointy things where you've cut a tree and it's sharp and it's like perfect for impaling your heel. And there was a man like sitting close to us who kind of mumbled something while looking away. And then the girl got up and just stopped and she grabbed a machete and she cut that off, right? And he had totally given her a command and I hadn't picked up on it because it just wasn't the type of teaching. And I actually think the type of teaching that we use is probably misses out on a lot of subtle forms of teaching that are community specific. And I actually have a failed study that in retrospect was kind of interesting, but it didn't work, where I was trying to show Bayaka videos of teaching that Barry Hewlett had taken among the Aka, which was like culturally similar, but they didn't know any of the people, and ask them like, what, like, is this teaching, basically to see if their definition matched our definition. And it didn't work because everything was teaching, like even the kind of control things of like just a parent looking for lice in their kid. They were like, yeah, that's teaching. Like that parent is teaching their kid how to be healthy. And like, we wouldn't necessarily think of that as teaching. So especially for the Bayaka, they think of any behavior they do around an adult as a type of teaching. Whether or not that meets our kind of functional comparative criteria is something different. But I think there's there's a lot of work to look at how that might vary. And I think that example is a really good one of how very subtle it can be.
And just, sorry, quickly, there's going to be a bias too, probably, in like, so the reason I was able to pick up on that example, being a very poor forager myself, was because the action of the teacher prompted a reaction from the child, right? Like I saw the grandmother tap the branch, and then I saw the kid, and I saw that happen once or twice. And so I realized there was an actual response happening. But there's all sorts of teaching where there might be a similar kind of thing, but the information is not to provoke a specific action and response, in which case you would miss that, right? So, I mean, I think you're right. This is not an issue specific to your study. It's an issue about thinking about how to quantify and understand teaching in general, because we're so used to these Western models of really overt teaching, which does happen sometimes, but there's so much subtlety to it. It's just,
but I think it's a problem with my study and with many other studies where we're not starting off by asking people how they teach, right? And this kind of participant observation was a really good example of how you can pick up on types of teaching that might be more subtle or that might be more foreign. And I think, I really like Barbara Rogoff's work on open attention, and among the Bayaka, people talk about walking in the forest. And I mentioned this a bit about the talk. It's not just like the act of like the locomotion of walking. It's like tracking resources in your environment and knowing where things are and where things are changing. And so all of that really subtle stuff, you can't teach it in a really obvious way, because then you get fixed on that response and then you can't explore your environment. And this goes back a lot to the innovation stuff that we know from developmental psychology studies, that this more didactic instruction really limits children's ability to explore and find new ways of doing things in these experimental settings with these really fake, crazy toys. But I think these more subtle forms of teaching are a way to encourage knowledge transmission without blinding kids to other things going on. So I think like the kind of take home message for me is like that subtlety might be adaptive and we're like totally missing out on it. And we need to be starting out much more grounded within the communities. And this is, a problem definitely with a lot of the research I've done so far, and something I'm hoping to correct in the future.
That's great. I mean, the example that you mentioned is so interesting because it also resonates with this, imperative these days in research to involve communities in research. And so what you're talking about with showing people videos and having them comment on them and then what they're saying, I mean, it raises this question of, maybe they're right. Maybe those are examples of teaching, and maybe that should inform theories that we have about what counts as teaching, especially, maybe even from the perspective that you were saying that, we define teaching in terms of cost, which I'm not totally sure that should be the way that we do it. But even if you did, you might say, well, maybe there's really subtle things where someone is just taking the time to do something slightly different than they would have otherwise, and that would count, right? Even on that definition.
Totally. And I think Patricia Draper's example of somebody slowing down the stretching of a hide in a San community while kids are watching, she doesn't call that teaching. But as a researcher, you'd have to know the speed at which they normally, right? Like you'd have to keep track of so many things about the individual, but still is another really good example of just slowing down the process to do something is a great example of teaching, because it just allows you to pick up on cues that you wouldn't otherwise. But you have to know everything. You have to be like which one is it? Omnipresent or omnipotent, or whichever one of those it is.
See everything, right?
Yeah.
I know we're up near the end of time and it's late where you are. Can I just ask one final question? So, and if people need to go, please do. But, I was really curious, and this is probably something that's for a longer conversation later, but, it's really fascinating that you found this difference between communities in the gendered division of labor that then is reflected in what you see about the process of learning in kids. And maybe this was in your data, or maybe it could be seen in your data, but I was curious, like, how do you think that it's transmitted? Is it through like, yeah, you can think of so many ways that that gets transmitted. Like some might be more overt, you know, or represented in some way, and some ways might be just sort of baked into the sort of background of what people are doing in a way that the children pick up on. Do you have any thoughts on that from your experience?
Yeah, I think about it a lot, and I don't have a full answer, but I think, you know, there's a lot of flexibility in these communities in terms of gender roles, and especially, I mean, I can mostly speak to the Bayaka. I know in one case, I watched an adult get annoyed at an adolescent for not acting in a womanly way that he thought she should be acting, and she just left. Like, she was like, well, I'm just gonna go somewhere else. And, you know, she wanted to play and hang out with her friends, and she didn't want to be told she had to work. So she just went to see her mom, who was in another settlement. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for women to vote with their feet. I think there is a lot of self-identification of girls seeing what women are doing, boys seeing what men are doing, and wanting to emulate that. And I haven't seen in terms of work as much adults correcting. And I think I've even talked to some women who are fiercely independent who tell me, like, I just want one kid to keep my guy, and then I just want to be free to do my own thing after that, you know? And those tended to be women who were like hunters. Like they knew how to hunt, they knew how to shoot guns, they knew how to hunt with spears, and they felt like it afforded them some independence. And I didn't see a lot of other people bat an eye, you know, to that. I will say in the ethnographic literature, there's some evidence that as communities settle and there's more gender specific work, then those gender roles become a bit more entrenched. I'm curious about Pat Draper's work, which shows that girls are in proximity to women more. And so it might be that it just has to do with when there's more work, they get more work assigned. So it just might be environmental. So yeah, so I think I might be able to pick up on some of that in my data, and I have it written down in a note that I should look at it, but I haven't looked at it much more. And if that was the case, that girls are just around adults more and face-to-face more in multiple settings, not just the sun, I think that would be one really clear avenue in which a very small gender difference, a small sex difference even, can lead to very large gender differences depending on the environment. Yeah, it's a bit,
right.
Yeah.
Super interesting, especially because it seems like there's several somewhat discrete possibilities for what might be going on that then could be tested.
Totally, yeah.
Really cool. Okay, I'm gonna wrap it up there. I'm gonna send you, Sheina, a question from Molly that she put in the chat.
That would be great, thank you.
And I want to thank you so much for coming and for a fascinating talk. Let's all thank Sheina once more for her visit.
Thank you so much for having me, and I hope to connect. Please do shoot me an email if you had a question and you didn't have the time to ask it. I'm happy to answer it.
Sounds great. Okay,
Right.
thank you, and thanks to everyone, and I'll see you all next Monday for Chris Krupenya's talk.